Greetings, welcome. In this lesson, we will review lighting, cameras, and rendering for our Jack-in-the-Box project. Let's get started. The first thing that we'll do is turn on our resolution gate so that we can properly compose the scene. And we want a head-to-toe shot here. You can also click this icon, which will gray out the sides. If you haven't set your render dimensions, you would come to render settings. We'll open that. Make sure that we're rendering in Arnold. And in the Common tab, you can scroll down to the image size preset. And we've chosen HD 1080, 1920 by 1080. If you're rendering a preview or a practice, an animated GIF, for instance, 512 by 512 would be your pixel dimension for an animated GIF. All right, so render using Arnold, we're in the Common tab, and we've set the presets to 1920 by 1080. We'll go ahead and close that. We have our resolution gate on. And the final thing we want to do before we start positioning the lights is open our Arnold render view if that's not already available to you. So open Arnold render view. And this is sitting here as a free floating window, and I'm going to dock it. So I'll just grab it at the top tab and slide it over here till I see that blue line, and then we'll drop it, and here we've got it. Now, the Option key with our right mouse button allows us to zoom out, and our Option key with our middle mouse button allows us to track up, down, left, right. And so we'll just fill that space there. Now we're ready to begin. We're going to create 3 lights, and we'll position them according to a 3-point light setup: our main light, our fill light, and our rear light. Now, Maya has its own set of default lights. If we come to create lights, we can see those lights here. And then Arnold has a set of lights as well. And we can mix and match, and there's some issues with Maya lights rendering in Arnold, and there's issues with Arnold lights rendering in Maya, and so we'll take the time to talk about those differences and the overlap. So we'll come to create lights. I'm going to use a Maya light. I'm going to use a spotlight. A spotlight is a great interior light to use. So we're using a Maya spotlight as our main light. We'll just create that. You can verify in the outliner that a spotlight has been created. And in order for us to position this, or a convenient way to position your light, is to look through the light. And we can do that by coming to Panels, Look Through Selected. So I have my spotlight selected. I can see that in the outliner that it's selected. And we'll come to Panels, Look Through Selected. That spotlight was created and it's sitting at the origin, which is right in the middle of our box. And so I'll pull out, and you will recall from your first semester 3-point lighting assignments that we want this main light 45 degrees over and 45 degrees up. We'll imagine that this camera view is looking right down 0 degrees. If it was all the way on the side, this would be 90 degrees. And so we're going to place it about 45 degrees. And then we want to come up about 45 degrees. And we want this focused right on our Jack character. Now there are a couple of attributes that we want to dial in right away. We'll scroll up if it's not already available to you. Click the attribute editor. Once again, my spotlight is selected and we're looking through it. And we'll increase the cone angle, right? So that's the circle of light. And then we'll increase the penumbra, let's say to about 22. And we'll come back, and as we create the additional lights, we'll come back and dial in these attributes for the final render. But for now, about 80, at least in this view, and about 22 on the penumbra. Now, we're going to scroll down, right? This is a Maya native light. And so we need to scroll down to the Arnold tab. If that was closed, you can click on that to open it. And we're going to dial in the exposure, and we'll talk about samples and radius. But let's get back to our perspective view. So we're looking through the spotlight. We used our option left, middle, and right mouse buttons to dial in the position of the light, 45 degrees over and 45 degrees up. And now we're switching back to the perspective view, back to our standard perspective. Now our Arnold render view is open. It's an interactive rendering window, and we need to press play in order to engage it. And then we want to make sure that we're rendering our perspective view. And so we'll click play, and of course nothing happens because our spotlight needs the exposure bumped up. So I'm going to put that to 12, and now we'll press play, and now we'll get a result. Sometimes if you've got additional cameras, or sometimes it will stick to the light that it was looking through. So just make sure that you come here and we'll choose perspective. And in the middle of this lesson, we will create a camera and we'll switch the camera at that point. Switch this tab to that camera at that point. Here we have the perspective set, and there's our main light. It's a little hot, right? Whenever a light illuminates something to the point where it's white, that's considered over illuminated or hot. And so let's pull this down to 11, and now we're seeing that regular skin tone. The position of the light there, and that's good for now. We'll come back and we'll talk about samples, which is the quality, and then we'll talk about radius, which will soften the shadow. These shadows here have hard edges. Increasing the radius will soften that, but it also increases the render time. I'm going to press stop there. No reason for it to allow it to continue to render. I can hear my fans heating up because we just wanted to see the light effect. And once we've dialed that in, we can stop the render, stop that computational processing, which is heating up the processor. Okay, let's create and position our secondary light, and I'm going to jump into the top view. I'm going to tap my space bar, and we'll jump into the top view, and we've rotated this room 45 degrees, and this leaves us with a quadrant. Here's where our camera will be positioned, looking straight down. Here is our main light. And as we mentioned a moment ago, 45 degrees. If it was here, it would be 90. If it was behind, we'd call that 180, right? And our main light goes in this quadrant. Our fill light will occupy this quadrant. And then our rear light will occupy this quadrant. This quadrant here is the only one that doesn't have a light in a standard 3-point light setup. If this is your camera and this is your subject. All right, let's create that. We're also going to use a mile light, a point light, and we'll grab the move tool that's sitting at the origin, and we'll pull it over here. It's going to be somewhere in this quadrant. And we need to pull it up. It's sitting on the ground, so we'll pull that up. And then let's just jump back to our perspective view. And again, if I were to let it play, we don't see any result because we have to bump up the exposure. So once again, I've got the point light selected. Verify that in the outliner. We'll come to the attribute editor and we'll open the Arnold tab, and let's start with 12 once again, and we'll press play. Now that's over illuminated. Once again, it's not hot, but recall that our fill light is supposed to be about half or less than half of the main light, and so let's put that to 6, and there we go. And that might be a little low. Let's try 7. And very good, we can zoom in here to just get a better result, a better look at our result. And that is pretty standard. We have our main light illuminating, and then we have a fill light just so that our shadows aren't black. We want to be able to see into the shadowed areas. Generally speaking, there are always stylistic reasons to violate these principles or starting points. But we want to be able to see the object, and we want to have shadows. The highlight and the shadow create the volume or the appearance of volume, and that's what we're after. typically speaking, in our 3D environment. But we don't want to lose the subject by having completely black shadows. So our fill light achieves that with an exposure of 7. Now here's a good opportunity to talk about theatrical lighting. If you've ever been to a theater show, you'll recognize the richness of the lights, and one of the ways that that is achieved is to use complementary colors. To use one color for the primary light source and to use a complementary color for the shadowed light source. Or oftentimes that will happen organically in a theatrical lighting scenario. And so we'll do that here. We'll create our main light. So I'm going to come back to the spotlight and we'll click on color, and let's just choose a yellow. You can select your yellow here, pull that over. Now that's very yellow, so we'll tint it, right? Adding white is tinting our color. And there we go, something like that. We want to see that kind of warm hue. And then for our fill light, our point light, I've clicked it in the outliner here. The complement of a warm amber would be a cool blue. You can select the blue here, and right now a couple of things happened. In this instance, we can pull down the tint, or excuse me, add tint to it, but the dark blue, it's just like putting a blue filter on your light. The overall illumination has been reduced. So we'll come to the exposure and let's bump that up to 8, maybe 9. And then once again, I think that's too blue. So we'll tint it, right? We'll tint it, and then that means maybe I'll go back to 8. So a little bit of blue in our fill to complement the warm amber yellow of our main light. Okay, and then finally we'll create our third light. I'm going to hit stop. Once again, my fans are heating up. No need to let it continue to render because the preview allowed me to set these attributes. Once they're set, we want to stop the render. All right, I'm going to jump into the top view once more, and we're going to place our rear light here, sometimes called a kicker or a halo, and it will help us separate the subject from the dark side edge. It'll give us a sliver of light across here, or at least a sliver of light is what we're after. We'll come to Arnold this time. We're going to create an Arnold light just for variety. And just for your information, and you probably know this already, you could use any combination of lights. I happen to have chosen a spotlight. I like that circle. Used a point light for a fill. And then here we're going to use, just again for variety's sake, an area light for our rear light. Now once again, I'm going to say with that area light selected, I'm going to come and say look through selected. Panels, look through selected. That newly created light is sitting at the origin, right? So I'm inside the box. So I'll pull out, and we want it opposite the main light, right? We want it opposite that main light. I'm going to switch this back to perspective, and let's just jump into the top view so that we can see this. Oops. Now I was in my top view and I switched views, so I'm going to manually switch this back to the top view. And we can see, once again, the quadrants, our main light, our fill light, and then our rear light. And we'll have to increase the intensity, the exposure here as well. We don't have to scroll down because this is an Arnold native light. So there is no Arnold tab. The whole attribute set is geared towards Arnold. So no need to scroll down. We've got exposure right up front. We'll press play, and then that will allow us, and let's see what that 12 starts. And so pretty good. I'm going to look through this. That specular highlight there is a little sharp. And then we can decide on the rear color, right? We'll probably want it to be the same color as our fill. Or, right, you could use a white. I'm going to make just a very slight blue for that sliver. And in order to avoid that specular highlight there, I'm going to look through the light. Once again, I have the area light selected. going to look through it and just kind of pull it up a little bit and maybe get it closer. I'm going to zoom out here so I can see the total effect. And we can see that it's hitting this wall over there. We're not going to do any light linking, but just again, FYI, this is why traditional lighting folks love working in a CGI environment, because we can turn shadows off and on for individual lights. We can have certain objects not illuminated by a particular light. But we're just going to go with default all shadows on and all objects illuminated. Yeah, and so there is our fill. Maybe we'll pull that up a little bit. And maybe pull it around. We just want a sliver of light on the dark side edge. Now, of course, the animation is going to take place. You can scrub through. I'm not going to scrub through until we actually create our camera animation, which is going to be very subtle. And then we can scrub through and make sure that all the elements of the animation are in the light. So there is a pretty standard 3-point light setup. And I'm actually, sorry, I just want to make that a little bit bluer. Yeah, something like that. So there's our standard. We've got, let's jump into the top view. Right, our main light, which we used a Maya spotlight. Our fill light, we used a Maya point light. And then our rear light, we used a Maya area light. And we started the exposure on all three at about 12. Our exposure on the rear light is still set to 12. The spotlight exposure is set to 11. And your scene will vary slightly. And then our point light was set to an exposure of 8. Now, before we move on to the cameras, I just realized we can, on our main light, also increase the radius. I'm going to zoom in here to show you. We have a hard edge on these shadows, and so we can just soften it a little bit. The greater the radius, the softer the shadow, and the longer the render time. So there's a give and take there. I'm going to just put in 3, and that should be sufficient to soften it. But you can already tell it's slowed down a little bit. And if you wanted super soft shadows and you could afford the render time, you could increase that greatly. Samples is the quality of the shadow, and we will dial in the samples, especially for this main light, as we get to the actual batch render or render sequence. So there we have it. There is our 3-point light setup. I'll let you get to this point, and in the next section of the video, we'll take a look at cameras. All right, be right back. Greetings, welcome back. Let's create a camera. We'll come to Create Camera, and we'll choose Camera and Aim. This will give us a transform node for both the aim and the camera itself. Now that we've created that camera, we want to look through the camera. And just as we were able to look through the lights, we'll switch under Panels, Perspective, Camera, our newly created Camera 1. Sitting at the origin, just as our lights were. So we'll pull out here, scroll out, and then we want to turn on our resolution gate in order to compose the shot. Now I am at a point in the animation where it's fully extended, and so kind of head to toe, I'm at, in my animation, frame 390. Now we're going to set keys on the camera, and we just want some subtle movement to the camera. We're imagining that this is a single scene in a more comprehensive animation. So just this single scene, we're not going to create camera cuts. This is a cut, and we'll just give it some subtle movement. Now, you will recall that we'll open the camera group by clicking on the plus, and we'll make sure that camera and camera aim are both selected. And we'll simply key. So we're looking through the camera, right? With the camera selected, we went to Panel, Perspective, Camera. And note, we're not setting keys on the group. We're setting keys on the camera and the camera aim itself. Let's switch over to the channel box just so that we can verify that the keys have been set. So I'm at frame 390, and we're kind of setting the keys out of order. this is a shot that I would like to have, right? Looking straight down. And so we'll key this. We'll just hit S on the keyboard, or I'll do it the long way so that you can see it. We'll come to key, set key, or S on the keyboard. And we can see now in the channel box, there's the red indication that we've got incoming keyframe channels. And that's set. If I were to click on the camera, we see now the rotate is given over to the camera aim, so that's why that's not red. But that's what you should see on your camera and on your aim. They both have keys set. Now I'll reselect both of them. And we can scroll backwards, right? So here our guy is looking out, so let's compose that. Perhaps it should be up here, and we want to get the hat in there. And so we'll once again set the key, set key. Or maybe we even want to, right, maybe beyond 100%, the close-up. So I'll just set that key over. And you can check, right? So that's good. And then we'll pull back, so maybe about there, we'll set the key. So there's actually no movement between 290 and 310 on this. And then I'm going to come to 270, and we've got the smiling version. Maybe that's a little bit close. And we'll key that. So far I've got 270 to 290 to 310 to 390. And let's see. Yeah, so about here, I'm going to say 220. We want to see everything. And we can imagine we've kind of blocked out. I've got the helicopter in the scene. I've got the rolling robot in the scene. So we'll give it space to be able to place those elements. We might want to add some toys before we render. So just a broad view here at 220. We'll set that key, scrub through just to see how that's unfolding. And maybe we want to give it a little angle. We took all this time, so maybe he's looking that way. Yeah. Come to about 180, and this is just our classic Jack-in-the-Box spring. We'll set that. And maybe we'll just give it some interest there. And I'm going to, thinking and talking while I work, sorry about that. Let's have that zoom in a little bit. And the initial will be pulled out a little bit. So there we have it. It's kind of coming into the action. Looking around, and then drops down. Now we want to be able to have this loop just for presentation's sake. So I'm going to take the key that I set at the beginning. I'm starting at frame 50. And I'm going to, we could right click and say copy. And then we'll come all the way down to the end, and I'll right click and say paste. And so it's starting at the same place. So as this plays, and if we were watching it on a loop, or if you've got an animated GIF and it's looping, right, it's ending at frame 500 where it started, in my case, at frame 50. So just some subtle movement. I typically ask students to be very subtle in their camera movements. We don't want to recognize that the camera is being animated, or that shouldn't be the focus. Sometimes if you're moving the camera around too much, up, down, zooming in and out, it can be distracting. Now, of course, once again, there are stylistic reasons to do that. If you're doing a chase scene or there's some type of explosion or earthquake, then yes, you want the camera kind of discombobulated. But if we're just looking at standard filmmaking, err on the side of subtlety, and you'll get a good result. All right, so I'll let you play around with your camera. Just once again to review, we said create, camera and aim. We looked with that camera selected, we don't have to have the camera selected. We came to Panels, Perspective, Camera. We made sure that our resolution gate is on in order for us to properly compose. And as we set keys, we made sure that camera and camera aim were both selected. And we just scrubbed through and found good compositions and came up to key, set key, or hit S on the keyboard. And then finally, when we established our very first key, we right-clicked and said copy and pasted that first key to your last key to create a seamless loop. All right, in the next section, we'll review rendering. Be right back. Welcome back. Let's dial in our render settings. We'll open our render settings windows here, display render settings, and we can take a look at the path where these are going to render to. So your Documents folder, Maya, Projects folder, your default. Now, if you created a new folder for your Jack, you would want to come to File, Set Project, just to make sure that it was headed there. But in any event, if you lose track of where your image is rendered to, you can always come back and see what the path is. It's rendering to the Images folder of my default folder. All right, we want to name this. So let's call this Jack version 3. We're going to render as JPEGs. We'll leave the quality at 100. And then here is really important, and sometimes mistakes are made here because these are so similar. It's name.number.extension. Name.number.extension. Lots of similar varieties there, but make sure it's .number.extension. Our frame padding would be 4. It could be 3, but we'll just leave it at the default 4. If we were rendering 10,000 frames or more, it would be 5. If we were rendering 100,000 frames or more, it would be 6. We'll come down and rendering 1 to 500 in my case. Very important as well to select the camera. Sometimes you'll wait overnight for a render and realize you rendered the wrong camera. So make sure that render camera, camera 1. We already set our preset to HD 1080, which is 1920 by 1080. If you're rendering a preview, you can render it smaller. If you're rendering an animated GIF, it would be 512 by 512. And that's all we need to set up on this window here. In the Arnold renderer, the overall quality, I believe the default is 3. Now this is going to be dependent on your processing power. The overall quality, 4, 5, 6, somewhere in that range. But again, if you're doing a smaller or a preview, you can leave it at 3. I'm going to put that back to 6. And we're just going to leave all the other attributes the same. Now I did mention, coming back to our main light, I'm going to hit the attribute editor and our samples. We could bump our samples up here as well. If you're doing a preview render, leave that down until you're ready for your final. But I'm going to put that to 3 for the main light because those are the shadows that we're really aware of in the scene. So we've got, we've got overall samples for the Arnold renderer, and we've set that to 6. And then we have individual samples, and you just think of that word as quality. And we went from 1 to 3 for the main light, our spotlight that we're using as our main light. All right, real quick, you can see your path. We've named it JPEG, quality 100, name.number.extension. We set our frame range 1 to 500. We set our preset 1920 by 1080 or 512 by 512 if you're doing the animated GIF. We set the camera, made sure that it's set to camera. Arnold render, I've got it at 6. If you've got a modest computer, you could leave it at 3 and see if those results are sufficient. Now here we've got a little bit of a fork in the road. You certainly want to increment and save this. Some versions of Maya and the operating system in Arnold will render a batch render with an Arnold watermark. But not all computers and not all students report this, so this is a little bit confusing, and I haven't found a good answer as to why the educational version, which technically is licensed, has an Arnold license, would add that Arnold watermark to only some versions. So long story short, when we come into the rendering mode and you say render batch render, this renders in the background. But what I'm reporting here is that sometimes when we batch render, the Arnold watermark is visible. So what you could do, just to test whether that's the case for you or not, is to come and just render 2 frames, right? We batch render 2 frames and see if that watermark appears. If the watermark does appear, then we can't render in the background, and this is inexplicable to me, but we can render in the foreground and avoid that watermark. And that is render sequence. Render sequence. We're going to open up the dialog box and just make sure that camera 1 is available to you. And that's really all you need to do. But the unfortunate thing about using render sequence, because it's rendering in the foreground, you have to leave Maya open and alone. It's just going to render right here. So if I were to hit render sequence, right, as I've done here, it's going to go through and it's rendering in the foreground. I can't do anything else with Maya. So just be sure before you hit that you have saved the file, and maybe you're doing this before you're leaving for the day, or you're doing this overnight, right? Because this is going to take several hours. You can see how long it's taking for just 1 frame. All right. Questions in the discussion forum. Lights, camera, action. Have a good one.